Canada is a vast nation. It's the second largest landmass on Earth, dotted with huge tracts of forest, vast prairies, tundra, and desert. Few countries in the world have as much space as Canada, and yet somehow, today, this massive country doesn't seem to have enough space to house its relatively small population of 40 million people. House and land prices have soared to the point where the vast majority of wage earners couldn't afford to buy their own home. A recent estimate found that only 10% of the population could afford to buy a house in Toronto at today's prices. Those who got in earlier lucked out. Those who showed up later are locked out. Whether it's a single-family home, condos, or rental apartments, Canada isn't building enough housing. Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, the country's government-run mortgage insurer, recently estimated that for Canadian housing to return to its long-term affordability norms, the country would have to build an additional 3.5 million homes by 2030. And that's on top of what developers were planning to build anyway. Signs of the shortage are everywhere in the soaring cost of housing across the country. That's especially true in the priciest cities, namely Toronto, where the cost of an average residential property, condo, house, or otherwise is now above $1.1 million, and Vancouver, where the average property price is now above $1.2 million. House prices have jumped 375% in the past 2 decades, and Canadians are now dealing with some of the least affordable housing in the entire world. In a recent survey from Demographia, the city of Vancouver was ranked the 3rd least affordable city in the world, while Toronto ranked as the 10th least affordable city in the world. Relative to people's incomes, these cities are now less affordable than New York or London. Meanwhile, rental rates have exploded. The average rent for a 2-bedroom apartment in Toronto now runs $3,400, and in Vancouver, it's nearly $3,900. Even small, once affordable cities are turning pricey, with rent for a 2-bedroom now running above $2,200 in Halifax and nearly $1,600 in working-class Windsor. Young Canadians today aren't just losing hope they'll ever own a home, many are losing hope they'll ever be able to afford to rent an apartment. The effects of this are everywhere. International students packed by the dozen into a single apartment, thousands of Canadians evicted by landlords through rent-evictions, and of course the endlessly growing population of homeless people, recently estimated at 750,000 nationwide, or roughly 4 times as many homeless people per capita as California. For more on that, check out our recent video on the not-so-polite truth about Canada's booming homelessness problem. But how did Canada get in this mess? And is there any hope of getting out again? In this video, we'll answer both questions. Let's start with why this happened. As much as people like to blame the federal government for Canada's housing crisis, the reality is the feds are only partly to blame. Much of what has gone wrong with housing has happened at the local level. Once upon a time, Canadian cities had very loose rules on where you could build, if they had any rules at all. Canada always had high levels of immigration, but no matter how many people showed up on Canada's shores, there were always developers willing to build and space to build on. But over time, cities began to change. They introduced zoning rules that limited what types of construction could happen where. They limited the heights of buildings, dictated the addition of parking spaces for all new builds, and generally brought to an end the era of building what you wanted, where you wanted. A new phenomenon emerged: NIMBYism, the not-in-my-backyard phenomenon. Homeowners didn't want new developments in their neighborhoods. They wanted the character of the neighborhood they moved into to be preserved. So city councilors made it practically impossible to develop new houses in existing neighborhoods. But Canadians were also growing worried about urban sprawl eating into Canada's beautiful wilderness and paving over its valuable farmland. As cities expanded, they began to occupy large chunks of Canada's best farmland. Experts warned that if this continued, Canada would face serious food insecurity and would have to become entirely dependent on foreign countries to feed its own population. So politicians in various provinces and cities began to work to contain urban sprawl. And today, there is an urban containment boundary around Vancouver which protects the farmland surrounding the city from being converted into housing. The Toronto metro area has a green belt surrounding it which protects the wilderness and farms around the city. But it also severely restricts where housing can be built, and space within the green belt is running out. Meanwhile, Canadian municipal governments began treating new housing like a cash cow. Year after year, decade after decade, they raised the development charges on new homes, that is, the taxes they charge to developers for building new homes. In Toronto today, a new single-family home comes with a developer fee of $137,000. There are places in North America where you can buy a whole house for that money, but in Toronto, that's just what they charge in taxes on a new home. Economists often say that if you tax something, you get less of it. As developer fees have gone up, new housing construction has gone down. With no ability to build in existing neighborhoods and with land running out on the edges of cities, real estate developers began to bid up the prices of whatever land was available. By the early 2000s, land prices in Canada were soaring. Canadian land was no longer among the cheapest in the developed world. And then came the great financial crisis of 2008 and 2009, which, ironically, sent Canada's housing market into the stratosphere. During the crisis, the U.S. saw house prices collapse, causing a massive knock-on effect on its financial system. To combat the problem, the U.S. Federal Reserve dropped interest rates to rock-bottom levels. The Bank of Canada, the country's central bank, quickly followed and dropped its own interest rates to rock bottom. But Canada at that time didn't have a financial crisis. Its banks were running smoothly and its economy was stable. Whether or not Canada needed to drop its interest rates to such a low level is debatable, but that was the policy the Bank of Canada decided to follow. This gave Canadian homebuyers a massive amount of buying power. The lower the mortgage rate, the less interest you have to pay on your mortgage, which means that as mortgage rates drop, you can afford to buy a more expensive house. Canadians suddenly could afford to spend far more on a house, and so, not surprisingly, house prices began to rise. In essence, the Bank of Canada juiced the housing market, triggering a massive bubble that just kept on inflating for year after year. So at just the time that cities were making it harder and harder to build housing, driving up housing costs, the Bank of Canada made it much easier for people to take on massive amounts of debt buying overpriced housing. And now that its loose monetary policies have led to inflation, the Bank of Canada has found itself having to raise interest rates to combat that inflation, and that, in turn, is doing damage to households that are having a harder and harder time making their mortgage payments. According to Statistics Canada, mortgage payments in Canada have soared by 30% over the past year and are 40% higher than they were before the pandemic. And it's not only homeowners that are under pressure. Many of the investors who bought up Canada's condo supply in recent years also bought their properties on a mortgage. Often these were 20% down variable rate mortgages. This means that as soon as interest rates started climbing, these investor owners' payments started to go up. Many were under pressure to raise rents in order to cover their own large increases in expenses. Simply put, the Bank of Canada's anti-inflation policies are actually driving up both rental prices and monthly mortgage payments. And therein lies the great irony of the BOC's inflation fight. In some ways, it's actually causing more inflation. The Bank of Canada is an arm's-length body, not directly controlled by the federal government, so it doesn't make much sense to blame its mistakes on the politicians in Ottawa, at least not entirely. What we can blame the politicians in Ottawa for is the many ways in which the federal government, as well as provincial governments, gave up on all the work they used to do ensuring that housing in Canada remains affordable. For much of the 20th century, governments had a hand in helping make sure everyone had a home. The provinces and the federal government invested billions into social housing for low-income families. They gave generous tax breaks to developers to build apartment buildings, making it economical to build large amounts of rental housing. Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation used to guarantee loans to developers, and it even had a catalog of pre-approved home designs that developers could build quickly. In other words, Canada made sure that there was housing available at every income level. But then things began to change. In the 1980s, the Conservative government of Prime Minister Brian Mulroney decided the government shouldn't be involved in housing. Spending on social housing disappeared, as did the loan guarantees to developers. In the 1990s, the Liberal government of Jean Chrétien was faced with a massive budget deficit crisis, and it offloaded numerous federal expenses onto the provinces. The provinces, in turn, offloaded expenses on the municipalities. With everyone facing a budget squeeze, provincial and municipal funding for social housing dried up. Today's efforts at building affordable housing amount to a tiny fraction of what used to be built in Canada, and the standards for what constitutes affordable have been worn away to the point that any apartment rented for below the average rent is often considered affordable. With rents in Vancouver pushing $4,000 a month and $3,500 in Toronto, those subsidies are hardly helping the people most in need. Meanwhile, the federal government has increased immigration targets, putting even more pressure on the housing market. For many years, Canada had an immigration quota of around 250,000 people per year. Several years ago, the government increased that target to around 350,000 people per year. After the COVID pandemic ended, the government again increased immigration targets, this time to around 400,000 people per year. In 2023, that number is rising again to as many many as 505,000 immigrants, and by 2025, Canada will be taking in around 550,000 migrants per year. But that's not all, because over the years, Canada has developed other ways for people to arrive. One is college and university students from abroad, hundreds of thousands of them per year. Canadian schools love foreign students because they pay higher tuition than local students, so international students have become a cash cow for universities, and every year, Canada's schools depend more and more on the money they bring in. Another way of getting into Canada is through the Temporary Foreign Worker Program. This was set up to help businesses that are facing labor shortages, but today many say the program also suppresses Canadian wages. Between new landed immigrants, international students, and temporary foreign workers, Canada's population has grown by a record 1.2 million people in the past year alone. That makes Canada the fastest growing developed country and one of the fastest growing countries, period. For more on that, check out our recent video on Canada's immigration Ponzi scheme. And there is simply no way the country will build enough housing for them all. The reality is that Canada's federal and provincial governments are simply not willing to get into the housing construction game on the scale they used to be involved in, and that leaves the private sector to pick up the slack. But the private sector is maxed out. Industry groups have repeatedly said they are facing a major shortage of construction workers, and especially skilled workers involved in construction, such as plumbers and electrical contractors. Economists estimate that the current pace of housing construction, around 250,000 new housing units per year, is the maximum Canada can do. One hope for the future lies in home construction innovation. Take, for instance, Pact Homes, a company out of southern Ontario that builds accessory dwelling units, or ADUs, that can be put up in 5 weeks flat. Innovative solutions that allow developers to put up homes quickly could solve some of the problems. If the amount of time it takes to put up a home is cut in half, the same labor force could build twice as many homes in the same amount of time. But so far, these types of efforts have been few and far between. And high interest rates are taking a toll on developers as well, who are pulling back on home construction as the cost of borrowing goes up. In other words, it doesn't seem likely that the private sector will step up to the plate either when it comes to fixing Canada's housing crisis. The only certainty at this point is that this crisis will be around for a long time. To learn more about the housing crisis, check out our recent video on Canada's epic housing bubble. And if this video brought value to you, please consider liking and subscribing. Thanks for watching.